here is the thing that changes everything. Magneto said no on that beach, but he almost did not. There was a pause, a single breath-length pause, and in that pause lived a catastrophe that the Marvel Universe barely survived by never having to experience it. Everything that follows tonight is built on the distance between almost and no. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Feel the weight of the mattress beneath you, or the surface of whatever holds you now. The room around you is dim and still, and the world outside its walls does not require your attention tonight. Let the breath come in slowly, and release it more slowly still. You are here. That is enough. Let the next voice be the only one. It is 1962. There is a beach in Cuba that does not appear on any map that matters. The air smells of salt and jet fuel, and something metallic and scorched that cannot quite be named. Overhead, the contrails of missiles draw their slow pale arcs across a sky that has no business being this quiet. Two men stand at the edge of the water, both of them breathing harder than the moment seems to require. One of them is bleeding slightly. The other is not entirely sure what he is anymore. Erik Lehnsherr has just killed a man. This is not the first time, and it will not be the last, but the man he killed this time was Sebastian Shaw, a name that had lived inside his chest like a buried splinter for 20 years, working its way deeper with every passing season. And now, it is gone. The splinter is gone. Erik does not feel what he expected to feel in the aftermath of that removal. He had expected something like relief. What he feels instead is the particular silence of a room after a very long and very loud argument has finally ended. Not peace, the absence of noise. And into that silence, Charles Francis Xavier places his hand on Erik's shoulder and says the one word that could have destroyed everything. Stay. That is what he said. He said it the way you say something you are not quite certain you have the right to say. Quietly, carefully, with the specific tenderness of a man who has spent years learning when to speak and when to recede. He said it with his telepathy pulled all the way back, because he understood, even in that moment, that to place the word inside Erik's mind rather than the air between them would have been a kind of theft. And Charles had rules about theft. Even when breaking them would have been much simpler. He said it with his hand on a shoulder that had carried a weight no shoulder was designed to hold. And Erik Lehnsherr, survivor of things that were meant to make him incapable of exactly this, paused. This is the part that the histories do not linger on long enough. The pause, because the pause was not an accident, and it was not weakness. It was the most honest thing Erik had done in 20 years. In that pause, standing at the edge of the water with the late afternoon light breaking apart on the surface, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since he was a child, and the world still seemed to include him. He felt the specific and dangerous warmth of being known by another person. Charles knew what he was. Knew the camps, knew the experiments, knew the way metal sang inside his blood like a second heartbeat that never slowed, and had looked at all of it and still said, "Stay, come with me, we can build something that has never existed before." Sit with that for a moment. Let the weight of it settle before we go any further. Here is a man who survived conditions designed specifically to eradicate his capacity for trust. And he found, in the middle of a military standoff on a burning beach, with missiles overhead and the body of his torturer dissolving in the water behind him, one person who made him consider trying again. Let that be enormous. It is enormous. The impulse he felt in that pause was not delusion or desperation. It was the last living root of something that had been methodically dismantled since he was 12 years old, and it was still there, pressing upward towards the light. He said no. You know this. The water came up. Charles went down. The scream that followed belonged to both of them in different registers. The audible one and the one that lived only in the connection between two minds that had recognized each other. He said no, and he walked into the water, and he built what he built, and the decades of war and alliance and betrayal and painful reunion that followed unfolded the way they unfolded. And here is the counterintuitive center of everything tonight's story is trying to show you. The world survived, in ways that required both of them, positioned exactly as they were positioned. What you need to understand before we go any deeper into what a yes would have meant is why Erik's no was not the tragedy it has always been framed as. It was a kind of terrible, instinctive wisdom. He did not know this consciously. He felt it the way he felt metal, not as an idea but as a frequency, a resonance warning, something arriving in the marrow before the mind has assembled the argument. And the warning, as tonight's story will show you piece by piece, was entirely correct. The psychology of what shaped Erik Lehnsherr resists simple reduction. It is tempting to call it trauma and stop there, to say he was broken in the camps and the brokenness drove everything that followed. That accounting is too simple, and it is not fair to the man. Erik was not broken. He was reconfigured. What happened to him at the hands of Schmidt, who became sure, did not destroy his capacity for love or connection. Charles proved that the capacity was still alive by finding it without even trying. What the camps destroyed, or very nearly destroyed, was something more specific. His ability to extend trust before safety had been structurally guaranteed, not as a philosophical position, as a reflex, a survival mechanism so deeply embedded it operated below conscious choice. When Charles said stay, every piece of Erik's nervous system said, not yet, show me first. And Charles could not show him first, because what he was offering required the trust to come before the evidence. This is not a flaw in Charles. It is the nature of the particular dream he was building. The dream of a world where mutants could live openly, without apology or concealment, was a dream that required you to step into the open before you knew whether it was safe to stand there. It was, in its deepest structure, an act of faith, and faith, for Erik Lehnsherr, was an instrument that had been taken from him and used as a weapon against him once already. You have watched Scott Summers stand in front of the world and embody this bargain for years, the man who keeps his eyes covered because the alternative is too much for the people around him to absorb, who leads with composure and absorbs the cost of it quietly. You have watched Aurora Monroe extend grace to communities that regarded her with fear before they saw her fly. You have watched Jean Grey contain the most destructive potential in the known universe, because Charles taught her that self-restraint was the price of belonging. This is what Xavier's dream looked like in practice. Extraordinary people making themselves smaller and more legible to a world that had not yet decided whether to accept them. Erik looked at that bargain and recognized it. Not its terms, its texture. The feeling of performing your value for an audience that had the power to withhold its verdict. He had been through that before. He knew what the audience did eventually. And so on the beach, in the pause, what he felt was not a simple collision of trust and fear. It was something more precise. The recognition that Charles was asking him to become once more a proof of concept, an argument, an exhibit in the case for his own right to exist. He had been that before. He had declined to be that again. But what if the warmth of the friendship had been stronger than the recognition? What if the loneliness of 20 years, the specific loneliness of being the most powerful mutant in the Western Hemisphere, and having found for the first time one person who could meet you at the level where you actually lived, had tipped the scale just slightly further than fear? The alternate history does not require a different Erik. It requires only a slightly longer pause. One more second of warmth before the cold water. In that world, the first thing that changes is invisible. Erik walks back toward Charles instead of into the waves. The missiles overhead continue their arc. The beach smells the same. The sky looks the same. But the shape of the next 60 years has already been redrawn, and the redrawing has made it worse. And neither of them knows this yet because the damage is in the future. And the future always looks like hope when you are standing in it for the first time. The hardest thing to hold in mind about the alternate timeline is how reasonable it would have looked in its early months. Two brilliant men who had found each other, who had, against the specific weight of everything each of them was carrying, managed to form a friendship that was genuinely equal and genuinely curious, the kind that changes the shape of a life permanently. That friendship translating itself into a shared project. The school growing, the team expanding, the two of them in rooms together, disagreeing about tactics, talking past midnight, building something that neither of them could have imagined building alone. From the outside, it would have appeared to be everything that the story was missing. From the inside, a pressure was building that had no clean release. What makes the alternate timeline so difficult to mourn is precisely this. It would have been real. The warmth would have been real. The collaboration would have been genuine. The specific pleasure of spending your days alongside the one person who can meet you at the level where you actually live. Erik would have felt that pleasure, and it would have been everything he did not allow himself to have in the primary timeline. He chose to give it up. Not because it was not worth having, but because having it required him to become something he was not. And becoming that thing, however comfortable, however welcome, would eventually have made both of them pay a price that the dream could not survive. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like stubbornness. It looks like a man walking into the water when someone is reaching for him. But Erik Lehnsherr, in the pause on the beach, was performing an act that required him to refuse the most compelling offer he had received since childhood. The offer of belonging without the cost of performance. The offer of being known and wanted anyway. He refused it for the right reasons. He refused it because he understood in the marrow something that Charles had not yet had occasion to learn, that some things can only be preserved from outside the room where they live. The world that followed would have looked different from the outside, brighter perhaps and more coherent, with the two poles of mutant thought suddenly occupying the same space instead of defining each other from a distance. If you had seen it forming, you might have felt something that resembled hope. You would have been watching a catastrophe assembling itself in the quiet, dressed in the clothes of a dream that was too good to question and too large to survive itself. For now, let the question settle over you like the last of the evening light. The breath in your chest is slower than it was. The room is very still. You are close to the edge of sleep, and the edge is soft tonight. Let the next part of the story find you in the gentleness of that place. Charles Xavier could read minds. He could sit across a room from you and know your deepest grief before you had found words for it yourself. He could feel the specific texture of someone's oldest fear, the way it had settled into the architecture of their thinking over years and decades, the shape it had given to everything they noticed, and everything they preferred not to see. And for all of that, for all the extraordinary, unprecedented reach of his gift, he never truly understood Erik Lehnsherr. Not the part that mattered most, not the wound underneath the wound. Settle in. Let the room hold you the way rooms do when you stop fighting them. If there is tension anywhere in your body, in the jaw, in the space behind the eyes, in the held posture of shoulders that have carried too much today, let it go now, slowly, the way sand gives way under water. You are listening tonight. That is the only work. To understand why a yes from Erik would have been a catastrophe, you first have to understand what he carried into that beach meeting, not as metaphor or symbol, but as embodied, cellular, specific memory. He was 12 years old when the gates of the camp closed behind him. The world he entered on the other side of those gates was one in which the ordinary moral contract between human beings had been suspended by official decree in an orderly fashion by people who went home to their families in the evenings. The men who maintained that world were not in the main monsters in the way the word is usually meant. Some of them were educated. Some of them were kind to their children. They had simply decided, or been told, or gradually absorbed without quite deciding, that a certain category of people did not qualify for the protections that applied to everyone else. Sebastian Shaw, then called Klaus Schmidt, noticed Erik in the camp because of something he could do. He noticed the way metal stirred in the vicinity of a frightened 12-year-old, the subtle resonance of objects responding to distress that had no other outlet. He recognized it immediately as something useful. What followed was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a systematic and deliberate effort to understand a weapon by breaking the person who carried it, applying pressure to the wound until the wound became a skill. This is the origin of what Magneto became. Not the mutation. Erik had the mutation before. The origin of what the mutation became is Schmidt's experiment in applied suffering. You do not emerge from that kind of shaping with your model of the world intact. What Erik learned, not as philosophy, not as conclusion, but with his nervous system, with the body, with the part of the self that operates before language and outlasts it, is that institutions designed to protect people will fail those people the moment that protection becomes politically inconvenient. He learned that the category of persons who deserve safety is not a moral category. It is a political one. And he learned, perhaps most devastatingly, that the speed with which that category can be redrawn is astonishing. You are a neighbor. You are a resident. You are a problem. You are a category. Each of those transitions happened faster than the one before it. Here is where Charles Xavier's extraordinary gift became, simultaneously, his most precise limitation. He could read minds. He could feel the texture of Erik's loss, the weight of it, the specific layering of grief upon grief that decades of survival had deposited. He felt it, and he was devastated by it, and he grieved it genuinely. What he could not do was understand it from the inside, because Charles had never lived inside a world that decided, with official documentation and institutional authority, that he did not belong to the category of people who mattered. Charles had wealth. He had an estate large enough to become a school. He had a mutation that, crucially and accidentally, could be concealed. A man in a wheelchair with an extraordinarily powerful mind reads to a government looking for something to fear, as a philosopher, not a threat. He discovered his difference privately, in safety, in a home that already belonged to him. His mutancy arrived as a revelation, then as a vocation. Erik's arrived as a weapon that was taken from him and used against him before he was old enough to understand what it was. This asymmetry is not a reason to dismiss Xavier's dream. The dream was genuine, and it was generous, and it was built on an observation about human possibility that was not wrong. But the asymmetry created a gap in understanding between them that deepened with time, rather than closing. When Charles imagined what it would take for humans and mutants to coexist in peace, he was imagining from the position of someone who had always, at least partially, belonged to something. He had belonged to academia, to wealth, to the particular invisible texture of inherited privilege that only becomes visible when it is removed. His vision of coexistence was therefore, without his intending it to be, a vision that looked more like his starting point than like Erik's. What that meant in practical terms was this. Charles's model of how change happens required patience, demonstration, trust-building over long arcs of time. Show the world that we are not what they fear, and eventually the world will revise what it fears. This is a model that works if the danger is abstract and the timeline is long. It does not work if the danger is immediate, and the people asked to wait do not have the luxury of the long view, because they have already watched what the long view costs when the political winds shift. Erik did not want war, in the simple and often used sense of that word. What he wanted was something more precise and more radical, unconditional structural safety. Not tolerance. Tolerance is a gift, and gifts can be revoked. Not acceptance. Acceptance granted by those with the power to withhold it is just another form of contingency. He wanted a guarantee that could not be undone by the next election or the next crisis or the next convenient recategorization. He had lived through a world where exactly those guarantees were dissolved in the span of a few years. He knew with his whole body how quickly it could happen. And so, when Charles offered the dream on that beach, the invitation to come inside, to help build the proof of concept, to stand as evidence that mutants and humans could share the world without catastrophe. Erik felt two things at once. He felt the genuine pull of it, the warmth of it, the specific relief of being offered belonging by someone who genuinely meant it. And beneath that warmth, beneath the pull, he felt the old intelligence of his body saying, "You have heard something shaped like this before. You know what came after it." If Erik had said yes under these conditions, carrying this specific wound, this specific model of the world, what would he have brought to the Alliance in practice? He would have brought extraordinary capability, strategic intelligence of a quality that Charles's more idealistic thinking genuinely lacked, the particular ferocity of a man who has decided that he will not be helpless again. He would also have brought, invisible to the eye but present in every interaction, the slow and steady pressure of a man waiting to be betrayed. Not because he wanted to be, not because he was cynical by election, but because every datum his life had provided pointed in that direction. And not even the strongest friendship, not even one as rare and real as his friendship with Charles, could fully override the intelligence of a nervous system that has learned to read danger before the conscious mind has assembled the argument. The alliance would have had tensions from the first month, quiet ones, the kind that do not announce themselves. Moments when Charles made a decision about how to present their case to a government official, and Erik said nothing, but his hands closed around the arms of a chair with a fraction more force than the moment required. Moments when Erik held back a response, and Charles, who did not need telepathy to read the people closest to him, felt the held-back quality of the silence. These moments would have accumulated. They always do. They are the record of a relationship's true temperature, and the record would have shown from the beginning a slow and steady cooling beneath the warmth. You have seen this dynamic in the relationships within the school across the years. Scott Summers holding something back from Logan. Jean containing something she did not yet have language for. There is always a fault line between those who believe in the dream because they can afford to, and those who believe in it because they have decided to, despite everything that has argued against it. The latter form of belief is more fragile. It is also more heroic. And it shatters differently when it finally breaks, not with a crack, but with a silence that expands until there is nothing left inside it. Charles Xavier could read minds. He could feel the shape of Erik's love for him. And the love was real. It was vast. It was the particular love that only forms between two people who have recognized themselves in each other for the first time in their lives. He could feel it clearly. What he could not feel, what the telepathy did not reach, perhaps because it was not a thought, but a fact, not a feeling, but a structure, was the edge beneath the love. The place where Erik's capacity for trust ended and the older knowledge began. In a world where Erik said yes, that edge would have grown sharper with every passing year. And Charles, believing what he believed about the fundamental improvability of human beings, would never have seen it coming until the moment it finally cut. There is a particular kind of blind spot that generosity produces. Charles Xavier, who had given and continued giving without keeping accounts, had arrived at a genuine difficulty imagining what it felt like to be someone for whom generosity had been consistently weaponized. When he offered safety, he was offering it from a surplus of resources, of confidence, of the specific security that comes from having always lived in a world that included you in its foundational promises. When Erik heard the offer of safety, he was hearing it from a deficit, from the position of someone who knew what it cost, what it extracted, what it eventually demanded in return. The same words landed in entirely different architectures of meaning. In the alternate timeline, this gap would never close. It would narrow in the first year or two, as shared experience accumulated and trust built itself on the smaller scale of daily collaboration. But the structural asymmetry, Charles's safety as a default condition, Erik's as a perpetual negotiation, would have remained, generating its quiet pressure beneath every conversation and every decision. It is the kind of gap that two people who genuinely love each other can maintain indefinitely at a distance. At close range, under operational pressure, in the thick of decisions that cannot wait for the right moment, it becomes the thing that everything else eventually breaks along. The wound that Xavier could not read was not in the end a wound that any amount of telepathy could have fully reached, because it was not located in memory or emotion or any of the registers that thought inhabits. It was located in the specific organization of a body and a nervous system that had been shaped by experiences no mind-reading could translate into equivalent feeling. Erik was not broken by what happened to him. He was rebuilt by it. The rebuilding produced something extraordinary. A man of immense capability, extraordinary moral seriousness, and loyalty that once given was among the most durable things in the world. The cost of the rebuilding was a set of perceptions and reflexes that were not, in certain crucial situations, available for revision no matter how good the reasons offered. Charles could see the product of that rebuilding. He could not see the process that produced it. And the process was everything. Let that understanding rest. You do not need to carry it tightly. Your breath is longer now than it was at the beginning of this part of the story. Let it stay long. The room is quiet. What comes next is the architecture of the dream itself, the beautiful thing, and what lived underneath it that the architect never examined. Charles Xavier's dream was not what he said it was, not because he was dishonest, because he was among the most genuinely honest people in the story we are telling tonight, but because the most dangerous dreams are the ones their architects have never fully examined. The foundations are laid in good faith, the blueprints are beautiful, and the structural fault runs all the way down to the bedrock, invisible until the weight of years finds it. You are comfortable. Whatever position your body is in right now is exactly the right one. Let the next portion of this story come in the way that real understanding comes, not as argument, but as a gentle arrival. What follows asks you to look at something genuinely beautiful, and then notice what is underneath it. You can do that without urgency. The night is long, and there is nowhere to be but here. The vision that Charles Xavier spent his entire adult life building was, at its heart, one of the most generous propositions in the history of a world that had not always been generous. He believed that human beings and mutants could share the world not through separation, not through the dominance of one kind over another, but through genuine, mutual knowledge. That if you could show someone what you truly were, not the tabloid version, not the risk assessment, not the fear-shaped silhouette on the wall, but the actual substance of a person, their humor and their worry, and the specific way they moved through a room that was too small for what they carried, then fear would dissolve into something better, not tolerance, understanding. He built a school around this idea, which was itself an act of extraordinary faith, not a bunker, not an armory, a school with classrooms and a dining hall, and a training environment designed not to manufacture soldiers, but to help young people develop a working relationship between their power and their judgment. He filled it with people who had been frightened, rejected, or hunted, and he told them, "Here, you are exactly what you are supposed to be. The mutation is not an error. It is the next chapter of what a person can be." He meant every syllable of it. The love was not a policy, it was a practice. Sit with that for a moment. Before the critique, before the examination of what lived underneath the beauty, sit with the beauty itself. Here is a man who had every reason to build walls, and chose instead to build rooms and fill them with light. He could have used his gift for concealment, for private advantage, for the accumulation of power in the quiet. He used it to teach. Let that be what it is for a moment, which is remarkable. And yet, the dream, looked at closely, had a shape, and the shape was not entirely neutral. The X-Men that Charles assembled were not a random cross-section of the mutant population. They were, in the main, mutants whose powers could be managed and expressed in forms that were legible to a watching human world. Scott Summers was a young man in red-tinted glasses who could have walked across any college campus without attracting more than ordinary attention. Aurora Monroe had the bearing of someone who had always, despite everything, known her own dignity. Jean Grey was brilliant and her telekinesis was invisible. These were people who could stand in front of a Senate committee and make the committee feel something other than reflexive fear. They were, in the specific sense that mattered, ambassadorial. But the mutant population was not composed primarily of people who read that way. Kurt Wagner, Nightcrawler, had blue skin and a pointed tail, and hands that felt alien to a stranger who had not been prepared. Hank McCoy's second mutation covered him in blue fur, and gave him a silhouette that no amount of articulate conversation could immediately domesticate. There were mutants whose every emergence into public space constituted an immediate and unavoidable confrontation with someone's discomfort. The dream had room for all of them, technically. In practice, the dream moved faster for some than for others. The ones who could perform legibility for a human audience moved fastest of all. This is the hidden architecture. Not a hierarchy that Charles designed, not a ladder that he consciously built. A de facto ordering that emerged from the dream's deepest assumption, that coexistence was built by winning human comfort incrementally, which meant that the mutants best positioned to win that comfort were the ones who made the winning easiest. Charles would have been genuinely distressed to hear it described this way. He loved Nightcrawler. He loved the Beast. He would have insisted that the dream had room for all of them, and he would have been right. But the room filled unevenly. The dream, like all dreams, moved at the speed of its easiest proofs. In the world where Erik stays, where he walks back from the water's edge and enters the mansion and begins building alongside Charles, he sees the school's beauty immediately and he loves it. He is not wrong to love it. It is, in any objective assessment, an astonishing thing. But his eye, trained by 20 years of watching what systems do when they encounter categories they have not yet decided to include, would have seen the silences too. The conversations that were not had. The assumptions baked into the curriculum about what mutant excellence looked like and for whom it was being performed. The first real argument between them in the alternate timeline, the one that reveals the fault line for the first time, would have been quiet. Not a confrontation. A divergence. A mutant family in a suburb of Cincinnati whose 14-year-old had manifested powers that frightened their neighbors and whose home had subsequently been vandalized, their windows broken in the night. Charles's response would have been immediate. A legal team, a statement, a meeting with the school district, the right channels, engaged with care and precision. Erik's response would have been to look at Charles steadily for a long moment and say something very quiet about the particular efficacy of right channels when the people inside them have not yet decided you matter. The micro-hook here is simple and devastating. Charles and Erik had the exact same argument that two people always have when one of them believes that systems can be reformed from within, and the other has watched those systems decide who they were willing to reform for. Neither of them would have been wrong. Both of them would have been right in ways that could not coexist in the same operational framework forever. What the dream required of its members, the thing Charles never quite named aloud, was a kind of ongoing audition. Not a deliberate one, but an implicit understanding that coexistence was something to be earned through demonstrated goodness, rather than something that was simply owed to any being that existed. The X-Men were heroes first. The heroism was the argument, and the argument was addressed always to a human audience whose judgment was still, in some structural sense, the one that mattered. Erik understood the cost of that framework because he had paid it before. He had been a person who performed his humanity for an audience that had already decided his category, and the performance had not mattered when the decision was made. What he brought to the mansion in the alternate timeline was not nihilism about the possibility of change. He believed change was possible. He was simply unwilling to stake the survival of an entire community on the hope that human decency would prove more durable than human fear. A dream built on the right foundation can still fail if the architect never questioned the blueprints. The foundation of Xavier's dream was genuine love. The blueprints assumed that human moral progress was reliable enough to be the primary mechanism of mutant safety. Erik's life was the most extensive available dataset on the question of human moral progress under pressure, and his data did not support the assumption. You have heard this argument in other forms, in other contexts across other centuries. The question of whether a marginalized group builds its own structure or integrates into the existing one is not specific to mutants. It is not specific to comics. It is one of the oldest and most persistent arguments in the history of any community that has been othered, and it has never been resolved, because it cannot be, because the answer depends on conditions that change, and on values that are genuinely in competition. Charles and Erik were the most intelligent, most powerful, most articulate possible embodiment of both sides. And the alliance, in trying to contain both sides inside one building, was attempting something that the argument itself resisted. The dream was extraordinary. The school was extraordinary. The love that built it was real. And the dream needed, for its own survival, for the health of its own foundation, to live in permanent productive tension with something that could see what it could not see. That thing was Magneto. And Magneto could only see clearly from outside. Inside the dream, he would have become part of what he was warning against. Slowly, without meaning to, the way any honest voice eventually learns the grammar of the room it has been absorbed into. and then he would have burned the structure down to prove he had been right. The school itself, its daily texture, its rhythms of teaching and training, and the particular domestic life that accumulated in a large house full of people who had nowhere else to belong, would have felt different with Erik present in it. Not worse, necessarily, in those first months. Different. He would have brought a quality of expectation to the space, a sense that the world outside the school's gates was not a theoretical problem, but an active one, pressing against the fence with the specific pressure of things that do not wait for you to be ready. This would have made some of the students more alert, and others more anxious, and Charles would have navigated the difference with his usual care. But the navigating would have cost him something. The school had been before Erik's yes, a space where the urgency of the outside world was held at a certain distance, not denied, but managed, metabolized into curriculum rather than crisis. With Magneto inside, the distance collapsed. What the students would have experienced in the alternate timeline's first years is worth sitting with. They came to the mansion because Charles offered them a version of the world in which their difference was not a sentence. They built their sense of what was possible around the proof of concept that the school provided. Here, in this building, in this community, we are enough as we are. The arrival of Magneto, of the most famous and most feared mutant in the world, who was also, somehow, Charles's oldest friend, would have complicated that proof of concept in ways that could not be fully contained by good intentions. Because Magneto's presence implied that the world outside the fence was different from the world inside it. And that implication, once inside the fence, did not leave. The dream's most significant structural failure in the alternate timeline would not have been dramatic. It would have been the slow erosion of the particular quality of safety that the school provided, not the physical safety, but the psychic one. The sense that here, at least, you did not need to perform your right to exist. That sense was the dream's most important product, and it was the thing most vulnerable to the presence of someone whose entire philosophy was built on the premise that the performance was always going to be required, that the audience was always going to be there, and that the only question was whether you were performing for them or refusing to. The most honest accounting of the dream's hidden architecture is not an indictment of Charles Xavier. It is an observation about the nature of any project large enough to have a real effect on the world. Such projects inevitably reflect the understanding and the limitations of the people who build them. Charles built the best dream he was capable of building from where he stood. The limitations of his vantage point were not failings. They were the conditions of his specific and particular life, as Erik's wounds were the conditions of his. The tragedy is not that either of them was insufficient. It is that the world they were operating in required something that neither of them, alone or together, was positioned to provide, a dream that could contain both the warmth of Charles's faith and the cold, clear sight of Erik's knowledge simultaneously, without the knowledge extinguishing the faith or the faith obscuring the knowledge. That thing does not yet exist. It may be what they were, between them, across their whole lives, still in the process of building. Let the breath out slowly, all the way until the lungs are easy. The room is very quiet. What comes next is the world outside the mansion, the world that was watching. A Magneto-Xavier alliance would not have calmed the human world. It would have given every government on Earth the justification they had been quietly assembling arguments toward for years. The dream was built on the idea that visibility leads to acceptance. In the alternate timeline, visibility led to something else entirely, something that moved much faster and hit much harder than either man had planned for. Come back to the weight of your body for a moment. The floor or the bed or the surface that holds you, it is solid, and it does not ask anything of you. Let the next part of the story wash over you like a tide coming in at night, slow and reliable, and not requiring that you do anything in response. You are simply here. The story is simply arriving. That is the whole arrangement. In the world where Erik says yes, the first visible change is subtle. No press conference, no declaration, just a presence, Erik's presence, first at the mansion, then alongside the X-Men in the field, then gradually at the level of the school's daily life. But presence is everything. particularly when the presence belongs to a man who carries the specific gravity of someone who has decided, permanently and without reservation, that he will not be helpless again. Every room Erik Lehnsherr entered became, whether he intended it or not, a room in which the possibility of great force was present. Not threat, force. There is a difference that most people can feel without being able to name it. Within months, the intelligence agencies would have known. The CIA had files on Charles Xavier that were already considered significant. The KGB had files on Erik Lehnsherr that were classified at the highest level of concern. The United States military had been attempting to assess the extent and implications of mutant abilities since the early 1950s, and the Cuban incident had moved that assessment from theoretical to urgent. A public or even semi-public alliance between the two most powerful known mutants in the Western Hemisphere would not have registered inside those files as a hopeful development. It would have registered as a strategic threat that had just doubled overnight. This is not a failure of human character, though human fear is certainly present in the response. It is the predictable and historically documented behavior of systems designed to identify and neutralize concentrations of power that exist outside institutional control. When any group, regardless of its intentions, regardless of its demonstrated behavior, becomes powerful enough to represent a credible strategic threat, the existing order responds with legislation, with surveillance, with the preemptive architecture of containment. It does not wait for the threat to become actual. It acts on potential. The Sentinel programs and registration acts that shadowed X-Men history across decades were not purely the products of malice, though malice was present. They were the predictable outputs of institutional fear encountering an unprecedented capability profile. Bolivar Trask was already building toward the Sentinels in the years following Cuba. His arguments to the military committees that held his funding were, in the primary timeline, still largely speculative. Here is what could happen. Here is the range of possible. Here is the threat that has not yet materialized, but which the evidence suggests is coming. In the alternate timeline, Trask does not need speculation. He walks into a committee room with satellite intelligence, with field reports, with a capability assessment that reads like a strategic briefing on a nation-state rather than an individual threat profile. He says, 2 men together constitute an operational theater-level threat that no existing military doctrine has been designed to counter. One has already used his ability to kill at the level of a targeted strike. The other can suppress the cognitive function of every human being in a given radius at will. The question for this committee is not whether this represents a threat. The question is what you intend to do about it. That is not a difficult case to make to a 1960s defense committee operating in the full anxiety of the Cold War, in the immediate aftermath of a Cuban crisis in which mutants had been present on both sides. The Sentinel program, which in the primary timeline required years of bureaucratic argument and competed for funding against a dozen other defense priorities, receives in the alternate timeline emergency authorization and a classified budget that does not appear in any public appropriations record. Simultaneously, the legislative apparatus moves. Senator Kelly, or someone functionally identical to Kelly, because the political force he embodied was structural rather than personal, has, in the alternate timeline, an easy case. The argument for mutant registration in the primary timeline was always somewhat abstract. Yes, powerful mutants exist, but they are largely heroic, and the threat they pose is ambiguous. In the alternate timeline, the threat has 2 names and a shared address and a documented record of capability deployment. The abstraction is gone. The legislation passes earlier, under a broader coalition, with fewer dissenting votes and less public debate than anyone watching from the outside might have expected. Consider what this means. The dream of visibility, of standing openly in the world without concealment or apology, would have produced, in the alternate timeline, the most comprehensive surveillance and registration regime in the history of anti-mutant policy. A mutant teenager in a suburb of Denver, who could barely manifest her ability without losing control of it, would have been in the same database as Magneto, assessed against the same threat metric, assigned the same legal category. The visibility that was supposed to lead to acceptance led instead to categorization. The dream had made itself into exactly the kind of target it was built to dismantle. The mutant community's response to the acceleration of the Sentinel program and the registration apparatus would have been its own fracture. Those who had placed their faith in Charles's method, in the patient, long-term work of demonstration and advocacy, would have found themselves suddenly visible, suddenly categorized, suddenly subject to a surveillance architecture that distinguished between no one. The X-Men and a frightened teenager in Denver were the same data point to the system. The equivalence was outrageous. It was also the inevitable output of a registration regime applied at scale to a population defined by capability rather than behavior. The micro-hook in the alternate timeline's 4th and 5th year is this. The dream was supposed to protect the community by proving its virtue. Instead, the dream's most visible moment, the alliance between Xavier and Magneto, had handed the community's opponents the clearest possible justification for the infrastructure of suppression. The opponents had not manufactured the threat. The threat was real. The two most powerful mutants in the world had stood together and made it visible and given it a name and an address. What else was a government supposed to do with that information? In the alternate timeline, Charles Xavier is faced with a paradox that the primary timeline never quite forced on him in this form. He had believed that the path to safety was through visibility. The visibility had produced a registration database and Sentinels that were operational years ahead of the primary timeline's schedule. His response, because it was Charles and Charles does not abandon what he believes without evidence that would break a lesser man, was to double down. More advocacy, more public demonstrations of mutant heroism, more evidence. He believed in the particular way of someone who has never stopped believing, that if the evidence accumulated long enough, it would eventually tip the scale. Erik, watching the Sentinel program develop in the windows of news programs and in the intelligence his own network provided, felt the familiar clarity of recognition. Not surprise, recognition. The shape of what was assembling itself in the air around the Alliance was not new to him. He had seen it assembled before, in a different language with a different bureaucratic vocabulary. He held his patience because he had made a choice on the beach, and he was a man who honored his choices. But the holding had a cost, and the cost was being quietly and precisely subtracted from the account of his willingness to remain. The days of future past timeline, the blasted Sentinel-dominated worst-case outcome that various X-Men spent decades traveling backward through time to prevent, began with exactly these preconditions. A registration database, a defense appropriation justified by a credible threat assessment, a political environment in which the fear of what mutants could do outweighed the evidence of what most mutants actually did. In the primary timeline, those preconditions developed slowly enough that there were windows of intervention, spaces for the counter-argument, years for the legal challenges and the political opposition to take root. In the alternate timeline, those preconditions arrived faster, in a more fertile political environment, with less time for resistance to organize. The Sentinels fly in the alternate timeline's late 1960s. The database is complete. The alliance that was supposed to prevent exactly this architecture has instead provided the ideological foundation and the strategic justification for its construction. The dream is still standing, technically, but it is standing in the shadow of what it helped build. And the man who had the most reason to recognize that shadow is still inside the mansion, still technically allied, still the person Charles turns to when the evidence gets hard to absorb. It is worth examining what the international dimension of the alternate timeline looked like, because the United States was not the only government watching. The Soviet Union had its own files, its own assessments, its own history with mutants that included the Cuban incident. A Magneto-Xavier alliance was, from the perspective of Soviet intelligence, not primarily a development in American domestic politics. It was the emergence of a third force, a power bloc that operated outside the bilateral structure of the Cold War, and that was not aligned with either superpower's interests. The Soviet response would have paralleled the American response in its broad strokes. Accelerated research into mutant suppression, increased surveillance, domestic registration programs. The effect on the global mutant population would have been to create synchronized pressure across the two most powerful states in the world, simultaneously. The international synchronization of the anti-mutant response in the alternate timeline is one of the most significant differences from the primary timeline, and one of the least obvious when you are inside the alliance looking out. Charles and Erik, building their project in the American context, would have been focused on the American political landscape, on Senate committees, on the Sentinel program's development, on the specific legislative fights that were most immediately pressing. The global picture, the way their alliance was being read by governments on every continent, the cascading effect of their visibility on mutant communities in countries with far fewer resources to resist the institutional response, would have been harder to track. And by the time the global picture came fully into focus, the architecture of the response would already have been established at a scale that made it very difficult to dismantle. Charles would not have been unaware of the international dimension. He was too intelligent and too globally connected for that. But his instinct would have been to address it the way he addressed everything, through persuasion, through demonstration, through the patient accumulation of counter-evidence. Erik's instinct would have been to recognize it for what it was, not a diplomatic problem, but a structural one, and to understand that structural problems are not resolved by persuasion alone. The disagreement between those two instincts would have added another layer to the operational divergence that was already accumulating between them. There is one dimension of the alternate timeline's political situation worth sitting with before this segment closes. The way the Alliance's visibility changed the status of ordinary, unaffiliated mutants who had no connection to either Xavier or Magneto. In the primary timeline, the ambiguity of the mutant situation, the fact that mutants were divided, that they had no clear collective voice or unified position, gave individual mutants a degree of political invisibility that was, in its own difficult way, a form of protection. In the alternate timeline, the Alliance gave mutantkind exactly that coherent collective identity, whether individual mutants wanted it or not. The kitchen worker in Cincinnati and the substitute teacher in Portland were now, in the political imagination of the registration system, members of the same constituency as Magneto. That constituency was now officially documented. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between a dispersed population and a category. Let your breath settle long and slow. The understanding that is arriving does not need to be sharp to be true. You can hold it gently, the way you hold the last thoughts before sleep, present without pressure. The room is quiet. The next part of the story is about what rises in the spaces the Alliance left unguarded. Magneto did not create the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He inherited it. He inherited a gathering of people who had already concluded that the world was not going to protect them. And he gave that conclusion a direction and a discipline and an ideology that made it legible. Without him, those people did not disappear. They gathered around something else. And the something else that formed in his absence was far less coherent, far less constrained by principle, and far more dangerous than anything the Brotherhood under his leadership ever became. Feel the temperature of the room. Not warm, not cold, just the neutral texture of a space that is yours and that asks nothing of you. Let your body go heavy in that neutrality. There is a complicated idea arriving, and complicated ideas land more cleanly when the body is at rest. It is tempting, when thinking about the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, to see it as Magneto's invention. He led it with a clarity that made it seem like his creation. He articulated its philosophy in language so precise that the philosophy appeared to originate with him. But the individuals who populated that organization existed before he arrived at their particular gathering. And their anger and their fear had sources that had nothing to do with Erik Lehnsherr's history or his particular ideological conclusions. They were already there. They were already burning. What Magneto provided was not the fire. It was the direction. Raven Darkholme, Mystique, had been navigating a human world for decades before she and Magneto found each other's purpose useful. Her mutation was, in its nature, a perfect embodiment of the impossible position every mutant occupied in a world that had not yet decided whether to include them. She could become anything except what she actually was. She had spent her entire adult life in borrowed faces, in performances of normalcy that cost something every time they were extended, and left nothing accumulated at the end. Every relationship she had maintained required a lie at its center. The rage she carried into the Brotherhood was not something Magneto manufactured. It was sediment, decades of erasure, compressed into the specific bitterness of someone who has been invisible so long they have forgotten what visible even means for them. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the kind of thing that deserves more than a summary. Raven Darkholme could become anyone. That is the way the ability is usually described, as power, as advantage, as an extraordinary gift. What it actually was, in the world she was living in, was a demand. The world demanded she become someone other than herself to survive in it. Her mutation was not separate from that demand. It was the mutation's most honest expression. She did not choose to be a shapeshifter in a world that refused her actual shape. She simply was one, and the world made sure she never forgot what the alternative looked like. Victor Creed presents a different and more uncomfortable case. His brutality has dimensions that exceed ideology. There is in him a relationship with violence that goes beyond the political, a quality of appetite that Magneto could channel but could not create and could only partially contain. In the primary timeline, Magneto's structure gave Creed a direction for that appetite, a target, a framework, an implicit understanding of what the violence was for. Without that framework, Creed does not become peaceful. He becomes entropy. A force without a vector is simply force, and force without direction finds its own direction, which is usually the direction of least resistance. The members of the Brotherhood, taken one by one, were not united primarily by Magneto's vision. They were united by a shared experience of having been outside the circle of people worth protecting, and having concluded, based on evidence that was not unreasonable, that the circle was not going to expand voluntarily or soon enough. Some of them were sophisticated thinkers whose conclusions were arrived at through genuinely careful reasoning. Some of them were people in pain who needed somewhere to belong and something to be part of. Magneto gathered all of them and gave the gathering a coherent structure, an argument, a strategy, a set of principles that distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable, even within a framework that the wider world called extreme. That distinction between acceptable and unacceptable within an extreme position is exactly what made the Brotherhood, under Magneto's leadership, a containment structure as much as it was a threat. He had lines. They were his own lines, drawn according to his own ethics, and they were not lines that Charles Xavier would have recognized as sufficient. But they existed. When Magneto said no, and there were things he said no to, the no held. The Brotherhood had a conscience, even if that conscience was calibrated differently from anything a more comfortable position might produce. In the world where Magneto is inside the Xavier Alliance, those lines are gone from the radical space. The energy that would have been structured by those lines, the urgency, the fury, the specific and legitimate anger of people who had run out of patience with a dream that was still asking them to wait, has nowhere to go that maintains a relationship with principle. It finds the available containers. And the available containers, in the absence of Magneto's particular moral framework, are not better options. Mystique operating without Magneto's strategic discipline is a different kind of threat than the Brotherhood ever presented. Her preference was never open confrontation. She was interested in something more subtle and more difficult to counter, the patient, systematic infiltration of institutions, the slow replacement of people who held leverage with people who owed her something, the quiet redirection of information flows and decision chains. A Mystique-led radical mutant network, unconstrained by Magneto's particular ethical framework, his insistence that even the war have a point beyond power for its own sake, would have been extraordinarily difficult for Xavier's more direct approach to detect, let alone counter. Every government department working on the Sentinel program would have been potentially compromised, every laboratory, every committee. And then there is the more frightening vacancy. Ensabanur, Apocalypse, the oldest mutant, or something very like the oldest, whose philosophy reduces the entire question of mutant survival to a single brutal and internally consistent principle. The strongest survive, and survival is its own justification. And the process by which the strong are separated from the weak is not cruelty, but the universe's oldest ongoing project. In the primary timeline, Magneto occupied the radical end of the mutant political spectrum in a way that made Apocalypse's position redundant for many of the mutants who might otherwise have been drawn to it. You did not need Apocalypse's brutal hierarchy if you had Magneto's militant solidarity. The ideologies were incompatible, and the stronger personality, Magneto's in terms of magnetic charisma if nothing else, tended to dominate the available space. In the alternate timeline, that space is open. Apocalypse does not need to fight for it. He simply fills it, the way water fills the shape of the vessel it enters. He moves through the radical mutant community not as a conqueror, but as the next available answer to a question that Magneto's alliance has declined to address. The mutants who concluded that Xavier's dream was insufficient now exist in a landscape with only one articulate alternative. And that alternative is Apocalypse's hierarchy, which is both simpler and more total than anything Magneto would have offered. The micro-hook in this dynamic is worth pausing on. Magneto's militance, which most observers of the primary timeline viewed as the problem, was in some meaningful structural sense the solution to a worse problem. His presence in the radical space kept Apocalypse's philosophy from gaining the purchase that the alternate timeline opens to it. His insistence on mutant solidarity, on all mutants, not just the strongest, was paradoxically a bulwark against the philosophy that would have culled the community he was trying to protect. The Shadow King adds another dimension to the vacancy. Amal Farouk, ancient, patient, a predator of the psychic landscape, preferred operating in environments where there were existing lines of tension and mistrust to exploit. A fractured, ideologically incoherent radical mutant community, full of people who felt betrayed by the dream and were looking for direction, was exactly the kind of environment Farouk found useful. He did not need to generate the tension. The alternate timeline's political landscape had generated it without his assistance. He simply needed to find the already open doors. You have watched Charles Xavier navigate this structural problem in various forms across the full arc of X-Men history. You have watched him deal with the consequence of the radical community's existence as a background condition of everything the dream attempted. What tonight's story has been trying to show is that the radical community's existence, under Magneto's specific and principled leadership, was not merely a problem for the dream. It was, in a way that neither man would ever have articulated to the other, a protection for it. In the world where Magneto said yes, the Brotherhood never forms under his leadership. The energy that would have gone into it, the urgency, the anger, the particular ferocity of people who have concluded that patience is a luxury they were never offered, finds worse vessels. The alternate timeline's fifth year is a world in which the Sentinel program is accelerating, the registration database is filling, and the radical mutant community is more fragmented, more available, and more susceptible to the worst possible alternatives than it has been at any point in the primary timeline's history. The dream had not prevented this. The dream had created the conditions for it by removing the one organizing principle that gave the community's most dangerous elements a framework they could be held within. The specific dynamic that Magneto's leadership provided within the Brotherhood was not widely recognized or acknowledged in the primary timeline's public narratives, because acknowledging it would have required conceding something that both the human political establishment and Charles Xavier's dream had good reasons to resist conceding: that the most radical expression of mutant anger in the known world was being organized and constrained by someone whose constraint was, paradoxically, a form of moderation. Magneto drew lines. He had ethics, not Xavier's ethics, not ethics that the human world was likely to endorse, but internal ethical commitments that shaped what he was willing to do and what he refused. Those limits were real, and they mattered. They distinguished his program from chaos in ways that had genuine consequences for the mutant community's most vulnerable members. In the world where Magneto said yes, and the Brotherhood never formed under his leadership, those lines disappeared from the radical space. What replaced them was not explicitly worse in any single instance. No single group that formed in the alternate timeline's radical community was, on an individual basis, more extreme than the Brotherhood under Magneto's worst moments. The difference was structural. The Brotherhood had a center. The alternate timeline's radical community had no center. It had 100 smaller organizations, some principled and some not, some genuinely concerned with mutant survival, and some primarily concerned with power for its own sake. The fragmentation made the response impossible to target coherently and impossible to negotiate with. It was, from the perspective of any administration trying to manage the mutant political situation, an unreadable landscape, and unreadable landscapes tend to produce the most extreme possible defensive responses. You have watched Charles Xavier spend decades trying to negotiate with a mutant political landscape that had exactly this shape, and you have watched how difficult it was, even with Magneto's organized opposition providing at least a legible address for the most concentrated radical energy. Without that address, without the Brotherhood as a comprehensible institution with a known leader and a stated philosophy, Charles would have faced in the alternate timeline a situation that his methods were even less equipped to navigate than the one the primary timeline provided. The tools of dialogue and persuasion require a counterpart. The counterpart that the alternate timeline's fragmented radical community produced was not one that dialogue and persuasion knew how to reach. Your breath is slow and long now. The night is moving through its deepest hours. Let the next understanding come to you the same way sleep comes. Not grabbed at, just received. The Sentinels were never built to stop what mutants had already done. They were built to stop what mutants could do. The distinction matters more than it might seem, because it means the Sentinel program was never fundamentally a response to behavior. It was a response to potential. And a Magneto-Xavier alliance, visible and coherent and declared, was the most comprehensive possible demonstration of what that potential looked like when it organized itself. Come back to the room. Let the ceiling above you, or the darkness behind your eyelids, which has its own texture and its own quality of quiet, be the whole of the world for a moment. This part of the story is about systems, about the machinery of institutional fear, and it is easier to understand machinery if you are not inside the urgency it generates. You are outside it tonight, just watching, just understanding. In the primary timeline, the Sentinel program moved at the speed of bureaucratic anxiety rather than genuine emergency. Bolivar Trask had to argue his case before committees that were skeptical, had to compete for funding against other priorities, had to navigate the resistance of officials who were not yet fully persuaded that the threat warranted the expenditure. The Sentinels that emerged from that process were formidable instruments of suppression, but they emerged slowly, in limited initial numbers, calibrated to a threat profile derived from incomplete intelligence about what mutants were actually capable of at the outer edge of their range. In the alternate timeline, those bureaucratic delays disappear. The ambiguities that created them disappear. There is no longer a speculative dimension to the threat assessment. Two men who demonstrably possess the capacity to constitute a strategic-level threat have announced themselves as a unified force. The threat assessment calculus is no longer probabilistic. It is definitive. It is worth holding in mind the specific historical context. The early 1960s were a period of extraordinary and well-documented anxiety about threats that could bypass conventional military response. Nuclear, biological, ideological, now mutant. The entire infrastructure of Cold War strategic thinking was organized around the recognition that the most dangerous threats were the ones that existing defense doctrine could not address. Mutants fit this template with almost uncomfortable precision. A population that existed within the nation's borders, that could not be reliably identified by appearance, that possessed capabilities for which no conventional military doctrine had been developed. A Sentinel program in that context is not paranoid excess. It is the defense establishment doing what defense establishments were created to do. Trask, in the alternate timeline, walks into his committee room with something he never had in the primary timeline. Certainty. Not a threat model, not a projection. Satellite photographs, field reports. A capability assessment that describes, in the specific language of strategic threat, exactly what two individuals could do to a conventional military force if they chose to. He does not need to ask the committee to imagine the threat. He can show it to them. The program receives emergency authorization within weeks, and a classified development budget that does not appear in any public record. The timeline compresses by years. The Sentinels that emerge from emergency development conditions are not the Sentinels of the primary timeline's earliest deployment. Under emergency priority, with a clearer and more specific threat model, the design priorities shift. The early Sentinels of the primary timeline were large and relatively slow, calibrated to gross manifestations of mutant power, rather than the subtler signatures of ability in early expression. Under the alternate timeline's emergency conditions, with a fuller intelligence picture drawn from detailed study of both Xavier and Magneto specifically, the engineering team can build detection systems tuned to the specific physiological signatures of telepathic and electromagnetic power expression. They can build countermeasures designed for the two abilities that have been determined to be the most strategically significant in the known mutant population. Before the Sentinels are even operational, the registration infrastructure is in place. This is the more immediately consequential development, because a registration database is not merely a surveillance tool. It is the technical precondition for organized persecution at scale. The history of the 20th century had demonstrated, with the specific and irrefutable clarity of actual events, how quickly a registration system could be repurposed by an administration willing to use it. The database that began as a national security measure could become something else in the hands of the next government, or the one after that. Erik Lehnsherr knew this with his body before he knew it with his mind. He had watched registration become something else before. In the alternate timeline, he watches it happen again. He watches it from inside the alliance that accelerated it. He is not without words for what he sees, but the words are not ones he says to Charles, because saying them would require acknowledging that the thing they built together has produced the thing he spent 20 years trying to prevent. And that acknowledgement would end the alliance in a way that nothing else could. So he holds the knowledge. He holds it the way you hold something that is beginning to burn, carefully, with the specific tension of someone who knows they cannot hold it much longer. Charles, in the alternate timeline, is confronted with a paradox that the primary timeline never quite forced on him in this concentrated form. The Dream was always vulnerable to the Sentinel program. This vulnerability existed before Erik's yes. But in the primary timeline, the program moved slowly enough that there were windows of intervention, years for legal challenges, time for the counter-argument to find its audience. In the alternate timeline, the program moved too fast for any of those countermeasures to take meaningful hold. The visibility that the Dream required, the refusal to hide, the public declaration of mutant existence and capability, became the specific dataset that the suppression program used to justify and accelerate itself. Charles responds to the Sentinel program's development in the only way Charles knows how to respond to things that contradict his deepest convictions, with more conviction, more public demonstrations of mutant heroism, more carefully managed media appearances, more advocacy, more letters, more meetings with officials who are taking the meetings politely and updating the threat assessment afterward. He believes in the particular way of someone who has never stopped believing, despite abundant evidence that belief alone is insufficient, that if the counter-narrative accumulates enough force, it will eventually tip the scale back toward the direction the Dream requires. Erik watches these efforts with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has already reached a conclusion, and is waiting for the world to confirm it. Not satisfaction, he does not want to be right about this, but recognition. The shape of what is assembling around them is one he has seen assembled before, and the fact that it is assembling more quickly this time is not reassuring. The days of future past timeline, the landscape of Sentinels and camps, and the particular desolation of a mutant community that ran out of options, began with preconditions that the alternate timeline assembled in compressed form, and in a more politically hospitable environment. In the primary timeline, there were decades between those preconditions and the worst outcomes. In the alternate timeline, the compression is significant. The line between the world of the present and the worst possible futures is shorter and more direct. The alliance that was supposed to prevent that line from being drawn has instead shortened the distance to its endpoint. Consider what the students in the school are experiencing in the alternate timeline's 5th and 6th years. They came to the mansion because Charles offered them safety. They stayed because the Dream made sense to them, because they could see it working in the world outside the mansion's walls in small ways, in individual interactions, in moments that felt like proof. Now they are watching the Sentinel program expand. They are watching the registration database fill. They are watching the evidence that the Dream was supposed to generate being used as the threat model for the program designed to contain them. The Sentinels fly in the alternate timeline's late 1960s. The program is more advanced than anything the primary timeline produced in the corresponding period. The mutant community is less equipped to respond, more visible, more catalogued, its most capable independent operators either absorbed into the alliance or scattered in the leaderless aftermath of Magneto's absence from the radical space. The Dream still stands formally. Erik is still in the mansion, technically, but the foundation has been altered by what the Dream's own presence called into being, and the alteration runs deeper than either of them has yet acknowledged. The design of the alternate timeline's Sentinels reflects a specific and significant intelligence advantage that the primary timeline's program never had. Detailed knowledge of the two most capable mutants in the world, studied over years of satellite observation and field intelligence, their abilities mapped and documented with a precision that the primary timeline's scattered and piecemeal intelligence record could not match. The primary timeline's early Sentinels were built against a general threat profile. The alternate timeline's Sentinels were built against specific known capabilities. The difference in effectiveness was not marginal, it was decisive. There is a particular feature of the registration database in the alternate timeline that makes it qualitatively different from the primary timeline's various attempts at mutant documentation, the timeline on which it was assembled. In the primary timeline, the registration question was debated, contested, legally challenged, and socially resisted over a period long enough for significant portions of the mutant community to remain undocumented. In the alternate timeline, the emergency authorization that followed the public declaration of the Alliance moved quickly enough to outrun the legal challenges and the social resistance. The database was substantially complete before the courts had assembled the arguments. The completeness of a registry is not merely a quantitative difference from an incomplete one. It is a qualitative one. An incomplete registry can be survived. A complete one is a different kind of instrument entirely. Charles Xavier understood at some level what the registration database represented. He was too intelligent and too historically aware not to. But his response to that understanding was filtered through the architecture of his deepest conviction, that the right response to a wrong structure was to work within the existing system to correct it, to build the case through legitimate channels, to trust that the legal and political framework would eventually produce the remedy that the wrong demanded. Erik looked at the same database and felt no such filter. He felt the specific quality of recognition that comes from having seen the instrument before, in a different form, in a different language, producing the same ultimate outcome. The database was not a political problem to be resolved through advocacy. It was an infrastructure that was already becoming something else. The mutant community living outside the mansion's walls in the alternate timeline's middle years was experiencing the world at a level of surveillance and categorization that had no equivalent in the primary timeline at the same period. Every registered mutant was a data point in a system that had been designed, from its inception, to serve a national security mandate, which meant that the data was available, in principle, to any administration with a sufficient argument for its relevance. The legal protections around the database were real, but not permanent. The political conditions that would have made them temporary were already visible to anyone who was watching the legislative environment carefully. Erik was watching. Charles was watching too, and reaching different conclusions about what he saw. The Sentinel program and the registration database together constitute, in the alternate timeline, the infrastructure of the worst-case futures that X-Men history has always treated as its most important warning. The alternate timeline did not arrive at those futures immediately. The political conditions required a few more years, a few more elections, a few more cycles of fear and escalation. But the infrastructure was in place earlier than in the primary timeline. The distance from where the alternate timeline stood in its 7th year to the landscape of the most dystopian futures was shorter, and the path was less obstructed by the counterforces that the primary timeline had developed over its longer and more contested history. There is a long exhale available to you now, a slow one, all the way to the bottom, until the lungs are quiet and the body is simply resting in the dark. You have understood something difficult. That is more than enough. Charles Xavier and Erik Lehnsherr were not in disagreement about tactics. They were in disagreement about reality. Two people who hold different beliefs about the nature of the world they inhabit cannot build anything together that lasts. Because every decision they reach together will be based on incompatible answers to the same foundational question. And the incompatibility will compound with every decision until the structure above it cannot be sustained. The darkness around you, if you are in darkness, is softer than the word suggests. Let your body be heavy. Let your mind be lighter than your body. What follows tonight is the deepest philosophical territory of this story, not an argument between two positions, but an anatomy of why the positions themselves could not coexist at the level of operational decision-making. You can follow it gently. None of it requires you to take a side. The most familiar framing of the Xavier-Magneto conflict presents it as a disagreement about methods. Charles believes in working within human institutions. Erik believes in working outside them. Charles advocates for patience. Erik advocates for the credible and demonstrated capacity to refuse patience when it becomes complicity. This framing is accurate in the way that a map is accurate. It shows the territory, but does not convey the experience of standing in it. The surface disagreement about methods sits on top of something much more fundamental, and it is the fundamental thing that an alliance cannot bridge. Charles Xavier believes, at a level beneath conscious argument, that human beings are capable of moral growth, not theoretically, actively, reliably capable. He believes that fear can be replaced by understanding through exposure. That prejudice is a temporary condition of ignorance rather than a permanent feature of human social organization, and that the long arc of human moral history, despite its numerous and well-documented deviations, is bent towards something genuinely better than what preceded it. He did not arrive at this belief naively. He arrived at it through observation, and through the choice to weight the evidence of human goodness more heavily than the evidence of human cruelty. This is not ignorance. It is a philosophical wager made with his eyes open. Erik's position is not the simple negation of Charles's. He also believes that human beings are capable of moral growth. He has seen it. What he does not believe is that this growth is sufficiently reliable to constitute the primary mechanism of mutant survival. He has seen the failure mode of human moral growth, the specific and historically documented conditions under which perfectly ordinary human beings who are capable of kindness and generosity and genuine decency suspend those capacities in relation to a particular group. He knows the mechanism by which that suspension happens: categorization, then dehumanization, in the specific clinical sense of removing a group from the category of beings whose suffering generates moral obligation. He has not read about this mechanism. He lived through its most comprehensive modern application. He cannot unknow it. Sit with both of those positions for a moment, not to resolve them, just to feel how internally coherent each of them is, standing alone. Both are built on careful observation. Both are built on genuine commitment to the survival and dignity of mutant kind. The tragedy between these two men is not that one of them was right and the other was wrong. The tragedy is that you cannot hold both positions simultaneously and act on them. At some point, when the decision has to be made, you have to commit to one model of the world, and they committed to different ones. In an alliance, you make joint decisions. Joint decisions require either a shared model of the world as the basis for the decision or a functional mechanism for resolving decisions when the models diverge. Charles and Erik had neither of these things. What they had was friendship, which is not the same thing. Friendship can sustain philosophical disagreement across a distance. It can endure it, acknowledge it, even find it interesting. Friendship cannot, over extended time, sustain the pressure of philosophical disagreement at the level of operational choices, of what to do tonight, with these specific people, in this specific situation, when the decision cannot be deferred. The first significant operational divergence in the alternate timeline would have been quiet. A specific incident, a Sentinel unit responding to a mutant ability signature in a residential area, and a mutant adult, not an X-Man, not affiliated with any organized group, simply a person living in an apartment, killed in the response. The official government communication acknowledges the incident, notes the parameters of authorized Sentinel operation, expresses regret. Charles drafts a response, a statement, legal proceedings, a meeting with the relevant officials. The apparatus of legitimate advocacy, activated with genuine speed and genuine force. Erik reads the official communication and the statement and sits very still. Not with anger, something quieter and more total than anger. He is sitting with recognition. The language is different from the language he learned in the camps, more sanitized, more bureaucratically precise. The structure beneath the language is exactly the same. An authorized operational outcome, a category of person whose death falls within acceptable parameters. He has read that sentence before in every language that a government ever used to make it legible. What he says to Charles afterward is not a confrontation. It is a question, a genuine question, asked in the specific quiet of someone who is not sure they want the answer. Does Charles understand what patience costs? Not as an accusation, as an honest inquiry into whether the person he is asking has the information required to evaluate the trade he is making. Charles's answer is everything that is true and insufficient at once. The loss is real. The outrage is justified. The work continues because the alternative is to let the outrage define the response, and letting the outrage define the response is exactly what the program's architects are waiting for. He says this, and he means it, and it is correct, and it is not enough. Two people who disagree about what enough means cannot share a framework for action indefinitely. They can defer the disagreement for a while. They can manage it. They can find individual decisions where the divergence does not appear on the surface. But the deferred disagreements accumulate. They do not resolve themselves in the deferral. They become denser, more pressurized, the compound interest of avoided reckoning. In the alternate timeline, the reckoning compounds through years 3, 4, 5. Each incident adds to the weight. Each of Charles's responses adds to the distance. Each moment of Erik's held silence adds to the ledger. The micro-hook in the middle of the Alliance's accumulated debt is this. The divergence was never going to be resolvable because it was not a disagreement within a shared framework. It was a disagreement about the framework itself. You cannot negotiate the framework from inside it. You can only discover through accumulated experience that you are in different ones. That discovery in the alternate timeline arrives slowly and then all at once. The question of Genosha, the question of whether mutants seek territorial sovereignty or integration, would have been the loudest articulation of the underlying fracture. Erik would have wanted it with the specific intensity of someone for whom the idea of a place where mutant existence was not contingent on human tolerance was not a political position but a moral imperative. Charles would have seen it as a concession to the idea that coexistence was impossible, a surrender of the dream's central proposition, which was precisely that mutants and humans could share the same space without separation. The argument about Genosha would have been the argument about everything, finally brought into the open. You have seen this argument in other forms, between people who believe that liberation comes through integration, and people who believe it comes through self-determination. Between people who trust the arc to bend, and people who have watched it fail to bend fast enough for the people who could not afford to wait. Charles and Erik were the most powerful and most articulate possible representatives of both positions. The Alliance, by attempting to house both positions in the same operational structure, was attempting to resolve an argument that the argument itself resisted being resolved. What ends the formal alliance is not a single dramatic event. It is the weight of accumulated deferred decisions reaching the point where the structure above them can no longer support what is being asked of it. A quiet Tuesday, an ordinary meeting, a question that receives two answers that are not compatible with each other, and the recognition, in both of them simultaneously and without needing to say it, that the difference between those answers is not a detail to be managed, it is the whole thing. There is a dimension of the ideological incompatibility that is harder to articulate, but perhaps more important than the visible disagreements about tactics and frameworks, the question of what victory looks like. For Charles, victory was a world in which the category of mutant had become as unremarkable as any other form of human difference. A world in which the mutation was noted and accommodated in the same way that any other characteristic was noted and accommodated, with a kind of ordinary civic decency that required no special heroism from either side. For Erik, victory was a world in which the mutant community had structural power sufficient to protect itself without needing anyone else's decency to be sufficient. These are different destinations. They require different routes. And a joint journey toward incompatible destinations is not a journey. It is a prolonged argument about direction that consumes the energy that the route itself requires. The chess games between them, which in the primary timeline carried the weight of everything they could not say to each other, the entire philosophical contest compressed into a board, a set of pieces, the slow accumulation of position, would have changed quality in the alternate timeline. In the primary timeline, the games were the conversation that the public version of their relationship could not have. They were honest in the way that games between people who genuinely respect each other's minds are honest, not performing, not managing, just playing as well as they could and letting the play say what the words could not. In the alternate timeline, the games would have become something different, a surface politeness, a shared activity that maintained the form of their friendship, while the substance of it was changing in the space below. The students who observed the relationship between Charles and Erik in the alternate timeline would have absorbed something from it that neither man intended to teach. What they would have learned, not from any explicit lesson, but from the specific texture of how two people interact when they are managing a fundamental disagreement while maintaining the appearance of alliance, is that disagreement is something to be managed rather than engaged with directly. That the expression of honest incompatibility is dangerous enough that it requires the discipline of concealment. This is a lesson that people in relationships learn sometimes, and communities learn it too. And it is one of the most corrosive things you can teach people who need, more than anything, to have a framework for honest disagreement that does not destroy the relationship it lives within. The ideology between them could not share a room, not because the room was too small, but because the ideologies required different rooms, different architectures of decision-making, different thresholds for what constitutes a crisis, different models of what constitutes progress and what constitutes failure. You can share a building with someone whose ideology requires a different room. You can pass them in the hallways. You can share meals and history and genuine affection. What you cannot do is make joint operational decisions indefinitely without the room difference becoming the most important thing in every conversation. The alternate timeline arrived at that point in its 6th year. It was never going to arrive anywhere else. Charles Xavier and Erik Lehnsherr were, in the end, not two people who failed to agree. They were two people who succeeded in naming the same problem from positions that required different solutions. The problem was this: people who are different from the majority of those around them need some framework for surviving in a world that has not yet decided how to include them. The question of what that framework should consist of, patience and persuasion or power and structural guarantee, is not a question with a correct answer that sits above the circumstances of the people trying to answer it. It is a question whose answer depends on what has already been done to you, and how much time you have, and how reliable you have found the goodwill of the people you are being asked to trust. Charles had reasons for his answer. Erik had reasons for his. The tragedy is not that they were both right. The tragedy is that being right in incompatible ways, when the world forces you to act, is functionally the same as one of you being wrong. Let the breath out slowly. The room is very still now. Your thinking has grown quieter than it was at the beginning of this segment. Let it stay quiet. The next part of the story is about what the Alliance left unguarded and what moved into the space. Every villain who feared Magneto did not fear him because he was good. They feared him because he was willing to do what Charles Xavier's dream would not permit. He was willing to act outside the moral framework that the dream required its members to maintain. He was willing to meet certain kinds of power on their own terms, rather than on the dream's terms, and those terms were sometimes the only ones that mattered. In the alternate timeline, that willingness was neutralized, and the world paid for it in the specific way that worlds pay for the absence of the one force that was actually suited to a particular kind of threat. You are here, solidly, quietly here. The night is well advanced now, and your body has been resting in it long enough that the rest has accumulated into something real. Let this part of the story arrive the way the understanding of a complicated thing arrives, not all at once, but in a sequence that gradually assembles into a picture. You are simply receiving it. That is the only work. To understand why a Magneto contained within the Xavier Alliance is a structural problem, you have to understand what his being outside it was doing in the primary timeline, not in the obvious sense of military opposition, but in the subtler sense of how his existence and his specific capabilities shaped the behavior of other significant threats. He was not merely an enemy of the dream. He was, paradoxically, one of the conditions under which the dream could survive. Not through cooperation, through opposition, his presence in the radical mutant space, his specific philosophy, and his particular willingness to act without the constraints of Xavier's moral architecture made him the most effective available counterforce against several threats that Charles, operating solely within the dream's framework, could not adequately address. The oldest threat in the mutant world is not Magneto. It is Unsabanur, Apocalypse, a being who predates the historical period, who may predate the concept of recorded time in any meaningful sense, and whose philosophy is both internally consistent and total. The strongest survive. The weak are culled. This is not cruelty as he understands it. It is the universe's fundamental operating principle, and his function is to enforce it, to accelerate the process that nature would eventually arrive at anyway. What made Magneto an effective counterforce to Apocalypse was not primarily his power, though his power was extraordinary. It was his philosophy. Magneto believed in mutantkind as a collective, as a people with shared interests and shared survival. Apocalypse's hierarchy would have consumed that collective from within, separating the strong from the weak and discarding the latter. The two visions were incompatible, and in the primary timeline, Magneto's occupied the space that Apocalypse's would otherwise have filled for the mutants most drawn to radical alternatives. In the world where Magneto is absorbed into the Xavier alliance, Apocalypse reads the political landscape differently. The radical mutant space, the space that Magneto occupied, and that his presence, his charisma, and his specific philosophy of militant solidarity defined, is now fragmented and leaderless. The mutants most drawn to radical conclusions are the mutants most susceptible to the language of power and inevitability. Apocalypse does not need to fight his way into their consideration. He simply presents himself as the available alternative to a dream that is asking them to wait, and an alliance that has accelerated the Sentinel program they were supposed to be protected from. The horsemen that Apocalypse selects have historically come from the mutant population that is in the deepest states of crisis and despair. Powerful individuals who feel they have been failed by every existing framework. In the primary timeline, Magneto's structure kept a significant portion of that population oriented towards something that retained, however violently, a principle of mutant community. In the alternate timeline, those individuals are available in larger numbers and with less ideological inoculation against Apocalypse's hierarchy. The catastrophe that requires the X-Men's most extraordinary resources to counter arrives earlier, and in a context where the team is more isolated and less supported than at any point in the primary timeline's history. The Hellfire Club's inner circle presents a second dimension of the problem. Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost, before her eventual reformation, were engaged in a project distinct from both the Dream and Magneto's program. The accumulation of economic and political power by a small number of highly capable mutants, structured as an oligarchy at the expense of everyone else, whether human or mutant. In the primary timeline, the Hellfire Club's operations were constrained in part by the three-way dynamic between Xavier's public moral authority, Magneto's underground military capacity, and the club's own ambitions. The contest between Magneto and Shaw for influence within the mutant community was itself a constraint on both of them. Each had to spend resources on the rivalry that might otherwise have expanded their respective projects. In the alternate timeline, that constraint on the Hellfire Club is gone. The rivalry between Magneto and Shaw no longer exists because Magneto is inside the Alliance rather than the radical space. The club's primary competition is now only Xavier's moral authority. And Xavier's approach to the Hellfire Club was always, structurally, the approach of someone whose methods required a very long timeline. He believed Emma could be reached. He believed Shaw could be cornered through institutional channels. He was right about Emma, eventually. He was less right about the timeline, and the alternate timeline gave the club years of relatively uncontested operation in the spaces that Magneto's absence left available. The Shadow King, Amal Farouk, is a different category of problem. He operates in the psychic plane rather than the physical one, and his methods are infiltration and possession, and the slow corruption of existing structures rather than direct confrontation. Charles Xavier is the most equipped person in the world to address Farouk, and he has done so more than once in the primary timeline. What limits Farouk's influence in the primary timeline is not primarily Xavier's active opposition, important as that is. It is the structural complexity of the mutant political landscape. A multipolar environment with several competing centers of power and ideology gives a psychic predator less leverage than a simplified one. Farouk feeds on tension and hierarchy and the specific psychic signature of communities under stress. A community organized around the dream and its clear alternative is already a stressed system. A community organized around the dream alone, with the alternative fragmented into incoherence, is a more exposed target. In the alternate timeline, the psychic landscape Farouk encounters is simplified in exactly the ways he finds most useful. The radical mutant community is fragmented and available. The Hellfire Club is operating with less external pressure than usual. The political situation is generating anxiety in the student population at the school, at a level that Xavier's teams are struggling to contain. Farouk, who has centuries of practice at reading exactly these conditions, begins moving through the available openings with a precision and a scope that the primary timeline's more complex environment would have made considerably more difficult. There is a specific category of response that the Xavier Alliance, in any form, is structurally incapable of providing, not because Charles lacked courage or conviction, but because the dream itself required a particular restraint in methods, a commitment to doing things in the right way, through the right channels, at the right cost, within an ethical framework that could be publicly articulated and defended. This is not a weakness in the dream. It is the dream's character. It is what made it a dream rather than simply another exercise in power. But it means that certain threats that required someone willing to act outside those constraints, to meet darkness on its own terms without the moderating framework of publicly defensible ethics, could not be addressed by the Alliance at all. The micro-hook is this. The X-Men were extraordinary at being heroes. They were less equipped to deal with forces that did not respond to heroism. In the primary timeline, Magneto handled those forces not as a hero, but as something that operated in a different register entirely. His willingness to act without the dream's constraints was, in certain specific situations, the only thing that worked. The alternate timeline removed that option. You have watched Logan exist in the space between Xavier's framework and what the world sometimes actually required. You have watched the entire apparatus of SEQILD exist, partly as an institutional acknowledgement that good people need their own shadow, a set of capabilities and a willingness to use them that the public-facing version cannot accommodate. The Marvel Universe is built on the understanding that the heroic framework needs its counterpart. Without Magneto occupying that counterpart space, the vacuum fills with things that are less principled, and less constrained, and less interested in the distinction between the mutant community's survival and any other form of power. The alternate timeline, in its middle years, is a world where Apocalypse's influence is spreading through the most vulnerable elements of the mutant community, where the Hellfire Club operates without its most effective counterpressure, where Farouk moves through a simplified psychic landscape, and where the Sentinel program runs without the underground resistance that Magneto maintained in the primary timeline. The dream is still formally intact. The school is still standing. Charles Xavier is still believing. But the threats surrounding the dream have been allowed to grow into forms that the dream, by itself, does not have the tools to address. The specific threat matrix of the alternate timeline's middle years was not merely a list of individual dangerous actors operating with less constraint than in the primary timeline. It was a system, a set of interrelated pressures that were reinforcing each other in ways that the primary timeline's more complex political landscape had prevented. The Sentinel program was providing the political justification that made the radical community's grievances more acute. The radical community's fragmentation was providing the recruitment environment that made Apocalypse's influence more effective. The Hellfire Club's expanded operations were providing the economic and political pressure that made government responses more extreme. These pressures were not independent of each other. They were, in the language of systems, a feedback loop, each element of the system making the others worse, in a cycle that required intervention at the systemic level rather than the individual one. The intervention that the primary timeline provided at the systemic level was, paradoxically, the conflict between Xavier and Magneto itself. Their opposition introduced complexity into the system. It created multiple competing centers of gravity that prevented any single dynamic from becoming dominant. Magneto's underground resistance limited the Sentinel program's operational effectiveness. His rivalry with the Hellfire Club's inner circle limited the club's expansion. His containment of the radical community's most dangerous elements limited Apocalypse's recruitment base. None of these effects were the result of Magneto being good. They were the result of the system having enough competing forces in it to prevent any single catastrophic dynamic from running to completion before the counterforces could assemble. In the alternate timeline, the system lost its complexity. The Xavier-Magneto alliance was, from the perspective of the system's dynamics, a simplification, a reduction of the competing forces from several to one. And simplified systems are more vulnerable to runaway dynamics than complex ones, because the complexity is precisely what provides the resistance that prevents any single process from becoming overwhelming. The alliance that was supposed to add strength to the mutant community's position had actually removed the structural element that was most important for the system's stability, the productive tension between incompatible forces. You have watched this dynamic play out in smaller scale, in the way the Marvel Universe's political landscape functions across its full history. The Avengers and the X-Men, SHIELD and the independent heroes, the tension between institutional response and individual judgment. What makes the universe function, what allows it to survive things that should destroy it, is not the presence of sufficiently powerful good actors. It is the presence of sufficiently diverse ones. The diversity of approach, the diversity of method, the productive friction between actors who agree on the goal but not on the route. This is the structural element that the alternate timeline's simplification removed. Let this settle into the background of understanding. You don't need to hold the details tightly. Your body already knows how to rest. The story is almost through its darkest terrain. What remains is the break, and then the meaning of the no, and the meaning is gentle. The first break was clean. 2 men, a beach, a coin, a brief and devastating severance that preserved in its very speed something essential about what they had been to each other. The second break, the one that the alternate timeline produces, in the middle years of the Alliance, would not be clean. It would be the kind of rupture that does not heal along the original line. The kind that changes the underlying structure of both people, permanently and in ways that neither of them fully anticipated while they were still inside it. Come back to the very center of yourself for a moment. The breath moving through you right now. Feel it moving. In through the nose, out through the mouth, long and slow. The story is approaching its most difficult territory tonight. You are safe here, in the dark, in the room that holds you. Let the narrative arrive the way water arrives at level ground. Not forced, not dramatic, simply finding the place it was always going to reach. By the 6th year of the alternate timeline, the architecture of the crisis is fully assembled. The Sentinel program is operational. The registration database contains the documented identities and ability profiles of several thousand mutants who have been assessed, categorized, and filed. The Hellfire Club has used the political turmoil of the Alliance years to consolidate significant influence in government departments and financial institutions. The radical mutant community is more fragmented than it would have been under Magneto's independent leadership, and the fragmentation has made it available to influences that are considerably worse than anything Magneto would have directed. Apocalypse is patient. He is always patient. He has been waiting for conditions that look very much like these for longer than either Charles or Erik has been alive. The event that ends the Alliance arrives on an ordinary day with no special weather and no ceremonial quality. It is the kind of event that the Sentinel program produces regularly by this point in the alternate timeline. A mutant ability signature registered in the database and responded to according to protocol. 3 mutant adults in a residential building in a mid-sized city. Not X-Men, not Brotherhood, not affiliated with any organized structure. Simply people who exist, who live in an apartment, who have names that the database does not record because the database does not record names except as identifiers. The Sentinel response is within authorized parameters. The official communication that follows acknowledges the incident and notes this fact. Charles receives the report early in the morning. He reads it twice, with the specific care of someone who wants to be certain they have understood what they have read. He is devastated by it. The devastation is genuine, and it is total, and it does not prevent him from beginning, within the hour, to work on what comes next. A statement, a legal challenge, a meeting requested with the administration. He translates the devastation into motion because motion is what he has. Because for Charles Xavier, the alternative to motion in the face of an unbearable thing is to absorb the unbearable thing without doing anything with it. And that is not something his architecture permits. He believes, as he has always believed, that the response to a wrong is to do the next right thing with as much clarity and precision as the moment allows. Erik receives the same report. He reads it once, then he sets it down on the surface in front of him. With a precise, deliberate care, that has nothing to do with the report's fragility. He sits with it. He is very, very still, in the specific way that people who have spent years learning the difference between reactions that cost them something and decisions that do not. The stillness is not absence. It is the presence of a conclusion that has not yet decided whether to announce itself. Sit with that stillness for a moment, because it is the emotional center of tonight's story. Here is a man who made a choice on a beach that went against everything his body was telling him, who stayed and built and held his patience through years of watching the thing he feared most assemble itself around him, who kept his word because he had given it, and because the giving mattered to him, who held on because Charles was still Charles, and the friendship was still the friendship. And now he is sitting with a report that uses official language to describe the authorized killing of 3 people who had done nothing except exist within range of the program that the Alliance's own visibility had helped to build. He sits with all of that. He is very still. For 3 days he says almost nothing. Not in anger. The silence is too deliberate and too precise for anger to be its only content. Charles tries twice to bring him into the work of the response. The second time, Erik looks at him with an expression that has the particular quality of the beach, the same face, older now, the same eyes with the same specific knowledge behind them, and asks the question he has never asked before. He asks whether Charles understands what patience costs, not rhetorically, as a genuine inquiry, as a request for information he needs in order to evaluate whether the framework they are both inside has the capacity to absorb what is being asked of it. Charles answers with everything he has. The loss is real, the outrage is justified, and it is his too. The work continues because the only alternative is to let the worst moment define the entire project. To let the fear and the anger that the program wants to generate be the thing that destroys from within what it cannot destroy from without. He says all of this, and he means all of it, and it is true, and it is not enough. Both of them know it is not enough at the same moment, in the same breath of silence that follows Charles's last sentence. The knowledge passes between them without requiring words. The Alliance does not end that day. It ends over the following 3 months, in the specific manner of things that have already concluded, but have not yet acknowledged the conclusion formally. The way a candle continues to burn after the wick has reached the wax, not with the same quality of light, but with the appearance of continuation. Erik is still in the mansion. He is still technically allied. He is no longer fully present. The part of himself that he held in reserve before the beach, the part that he had cautiously, over years, extended toward the dream, has quietly returned to its reserve position. The withdrawal is barely visible. Charles can feel it. The micro-hook in the architecture of the collapse is this. The second break would not have the clean quality of the first, because the second break would not be a choice made in a moment of crisis. It would be a recognition that had been accumulating for 6 years, and that finally reached the point where acknowledging it was less costly than continuing to defer it. The first break was sharp. The second would be slow and total, and would leave nothing intact that the first break had preserved. When Erik leaves, he does not leave in anger. This is the thing that makes the second break more devastating than the first. The Cuban beach ended in anguish, in the visible, audible quality of 2 people who cared about each other being separated by something neither of them had fully wanted. The second departure would have a different quality entirely, the quality of understanding. Erik would understand in a way that he perhaps had not fully understood at 35, that the Alliance was not a failure of either man's character. It was a mismatch of what 2 genuinely different people were built for, in a world that needed what they were built for to remain separate in order to function. He would say something precise and quiet. He would gather what needed to be gathered. He would leave. What Charles is left with, in the aftermath of the second departure, is something the primary timeline never gave him in quite this form. The experience of having tried the other version of the story, of having held the dream alongside the person who most fully embodied its counter-argument, and of having watched that experiment run its course until the course was complete. He is not broken. He is Charles Xavier, and the architecture of his character is not designed for breaking, but he is changed. He understands now, with the specific weight of direct experience, that the dream's survival is not secured by love or by intention or by the genuineness of both. It is secured by doing the work, all the work, including the work that the dream's own framework cannot perform. The students in the school experience the second break differently from any of the older X-Men who were there for the first one. They have spent their formative years inside the Alliance. For them, the departure is not a return to a previous condition. It is a new revelation. The first clear evidence that the dream, however generous and however carefully built, could not contain everything. That the two greatest advocates for mutant survival had tried to stand together and found that standing together changed, rather than strengthened, what each of them was for. This lesson lands harder on the students than anything the primary timeline had delivered to the school in the corresponding years. What Erik returns to, outside the mansion, is a world altered by the years he spent inside it. The radical mutant community is more fragmented than it would have been if he had never joined the Alliance. The Sentinel program is more advanced. The window for the kind of opposition that was his natural mode of operation has narrowed. He is older, which matters less for him than for most people, but matters nonetheless. And he carries something he did not carry after the beach. The specific grief of a man who tried the thing he was most afraid to try, and discovered that his fear had been correct, without having wanted it to be. The X-Men, in the aftermath of the second departure, face a challenge that the primary timeline never quite posed to them in this form. In the primary timeline, the X-Men were formed in the context of Magneto's opposition. They knew, from the earliest days, that the dream had a counter-argument, that the dream existed in a world with a Magneto in it. Their training, their philosophy, their very identity as a team was shaped in some part by that context. In the alternate timeline, they had been formed in the context of his alliance. They had grown up, operationally, in a world where the dream and its most powerful potential critic were on the same side. The departure returned them to the primary timeline's context, but without the years of experience navigating it. They were less prepared for the world with Magneto outside the mansion than the primary timeline's X-Men had been, because they had never trained for it. What the alternate timeline's collapse ultimately reveals is the specific and irreplaceable function that opposition performs in the health of any institution or community. The dream was stronger for having been challenged by Magneto than it would have been for having absorbed him. Not because challenge is inherently valuable. Not all opposition improves what it opposes, but because the specific challenge that Magneto represented was addressed to the dream's most genuine vulnerabilities, and in addressing them from the outside it kept those vulnerabilities visible, forced them to be reckoned with rather than explained away, required the dream to continually justify itself against the most informed and the most committed possible critic. Inside the Alliance, that function was lost. The dream's vulnerabilities were present, but no longer named from outside. They became internal tensions, managed rather than addressed, and they found the worst possible moment to assert themselves. The first break was a wound that healed into a scar. The second break in the alternate timeline is the kind of wound that has no clean scar tissue, that reopens along the original line of damage every time something touches it, teaching the same lesson until the lesson is the only thing that remains. Let your breath be very slow now. The slowest it has been all evening. In and out until the body is almost entirely still. There is one more thing to understand tonight. The most important thing. It arrives quietly, and it is gentler than everything that came before it. Here is the thing that makes this story something other than a tragedy. Magneto knew, not consciously, not with words, not with the formal architecture of an argument he could lay out on a table, but in the specific subverbal intelligence of a man who had learned to read danger before his conscious mind had assembled the warning. In that place, on that beach, in that pause, he knew that yes would cost more than no ever could. And the most important cost would not have been paid by him. The night around you is very deep now. Whatever you were carrying at the beginning of this story, you have been setting it down in pieces, paragraph by paragraph, breath by breath, over the course of this long evening. You are close now to the place where thoughts become lighter than the effort of having them. Let this last segment be like the final minutes of a long journey, the particular ease of almost arrival, when the motion becomes less effortful, because the destination is already close enough to feel. Erik Lehnsherr's no on the Cuban beach has been understood, for most of the history that followed it, as a rejection, a refusal, the moment when the great friendship broke and the Great War began. What tonight's story has been building toward, through all of its complicated and sometimes difficult terrain, is a different reading of that no. Not a comfortable one, not a redemptive one in the simple sense, but a more accurate one, which is its own kind of comfort. The no was not a rejection of Charles. The no was a preservation of him, or more precisely, a preservation of the thing Charles was making, which was more important to Erik in the bone than his own desire to be part of it. Because the dream needed, for its own survival, to remain in contact with its outside. It needed a voice that the dream itself could not generate, the voice that said what the dream could not afford to say from within its own framework. This is not enough, and here is what you are missing, and you will not be able to see it from where you are standing. That voice was Magneto, and it could only function from outside. Inside the dream, absorbed by the dream, it would have gradually become the dream's own echo, and then eventually it would have burned the structure down. In the specific fury of a man who has watched the thing he warned about happen despite the warning. What Erik's opposition gave Charles across the long years of the primary timeline was something that an alliance could never have produced. A permanent, living, articulate argument against the proposition that patience was sufficient. Every time Magneto made a move that confirmed the world's fear of mutants, Charles had a counterexample to stand next to it. Every time Charles counseled restraint, Magneto demonstrated what the cost of insufficient restraint looked like for the mutants who could not afford to wait for the arc to bend. Their conflict was not waste. It was not merely two men unable to stop fighting. It was the engine of the only conversation that the mutant community genuinely needed to have with itself. The conversation about what freedom actually required and who had the standing to define its terms. And here is the most counterintuitive reading of all the complicated material in tonight's story. Erik's no on the beach was, in the way that the deepest truths are usually expressed at angles to their apparent meaning, an act of love. Not the accommodating love of someone who gives you what you want. The harder love of someone who understands what you are building and refuses to participate in its undermining, even when participating would feel better. Even when participating is what he wants, even when the friendship between them is real enough and rare enough that saying no to it is one of the most costly things he has ever done. He said no because he knew, in the bone, that he would eventually break the thing Charles was making. Not through malice, through the simple and irresolvable fact of being who he was, carrying what he carried, built the way he was built. The thing Charles was making was too important to be broken, even by their friendship. Especially by their friendship, because the friendship would have made the breaking intimate in a way that ordinary opposition could never be. Let that sit for a moment. A man who had every reason to take the warmth that was being offered to him, who felt it and wanted it and was not wrong to want it, who had the specific and rare experience of being known by another person after 20 years of being only known as a threat. That man chose to walk into the cold water instead. Not because he did not love Charles, because he loved what Charles was building more than he needed to be inside it. The relationship that followed, carried across decades of opposition and alliance, of conflict and painful temporary reunion, of a friendship that neither of them could entirely abandon, because neither of them had ever found its equivalent anywhere else, produced something that the alternate timelines alliance could not have produced. It produced a permanent and visible and publicly conducted argument about the most important question of an age. And public arguments, when they are conducted between people of genuine intelligence and genuine commitment to the same ultimate goal by different paths, have a way of raising the quality of every other conversation in the same space. The mutant community watched Charles and Erik and saw something that exceeded the content of either man's stated position, the demonstration that the question did not have a single answer. That two extraordinary people could both be right in ways that were genuinely incompatible, and that the incompatibility was not a failure, but a condition. The condition of being a new kind of thing in a world that had not yet finished deciding what to make of it. There is a perspective from which the most significant thing about Charles Xavier is not his dream. It is his opponent. And the most significant thing about Magneto is not his war. It is the person he was at war with. Each of them made the other legible to audiences that neither could have reached alone. Charles made Magneto's grief comprehensible to people who needed to understand why a reasonable person might conclude that the dream was insufficient. Magneto made Charles's hope meaningful to people who needed to understand what there was to hope for in a world that was trying very hard not to let them. Every tradition that has thought carefully about the relationship between opposition and growth has arrived at some version of this recognition, that certain wounds, if they do not destroy you, do not merely heal, they teach. They reorganize the tissue of the self around an understanding that was not accessible before the wound. Erik was wounded before Charles appeared. What he brought to their friendship, and what he eventually brought to his opposition of the dream, was the knowledge of a man who had already been through the worst, and who could recognize it from a great distance. He could see the shape of bad things assembling while they were still in early formation. He could warn about them in languages that Charles, who had never lived through them, could not speak. That was not a flaw in their relationship. It was the thing that made their relationship irreplaceable. And Charles brought something that Erik could not generate alone: the capacity to believe in a future that the past did not justify. The ability to look at the full record of human cruelty, to know it, to have read it in the minds of the people who perpetrated it, to have felt its weight from the inside through the specific access his gift provided, and still extend the hypothesis that human beings could be better than their worst moments. This was not ignorance. It was not naive. It was a choice made repeatedly against the weight of abundant evidence. Perhaps the most radical choice in the entire story. Together they were a complete philosophy. Separate, each of them illuminated something the other obscured. The separation was the point. The no on the beach was the condition of the illumination. Without the distance between them, the light went flat. You have people in your life, perhaps, who carry a different model of the world than the one you operate from. People whose conclusions about how things work and what can be trusted frustrate you, or challenge you, or make your own conclusions feel less settled than you would prefer them to be. Tonight's story suggests something about what those people might be doing in your life. Not resolving the argument, not being wrong so that you can be right, completing the conversation, making the question real by refusing to let it collapse into easy agreement. There is a way of thinking about the Xavier-Magneto relationship that frames Erik as the one who failed, who refused the dream, who chose war, who spent decades making Charles's work harder and more dangerous and more costly. Tonight's story has tried to show you the other reading, the one in which Erik's no was not a failure of courage or faith or love, but a specific and costly act of each. The courage to walk away from the warmth. The faith that the dream would survive without him inside it. A faith that required, paradoxically, more trust in Charles than saying yes would have demanded, because staying required only commitment, while leaving required the belief that what he was leaving behind was strong enough to exist without his support. And the love, the hardest form of it, the form that does not announce itself and receives no credit and leaves the person who practices it alone in the cold water. The love that consists of protecting the thing you love from the ways you would harm it. The gift inside the no is not visible from the beach. It is only visible from the long view, from the decades of conflict and collaboration and painful recognition that followed, from the specific quality of the dream that emerged from the pressure of Magneto's opposition, from the kind of X-Men that a world with Magneto in it required and produced. The gift is not what Erik gave Charles on the beach. The gift is what Erik's decision made possible across all the years that came after it. The dream in the primary timeline was harder than the dream in the alternate timeline would have been in its early years. It was also more real. Harder things that are built against genuine resistance tend to be. Return for a moment to the beach. The Cuban evening, the missiles overhead, the salt air and the burnt metal smell, the body dissolving in the water behind them. Charles's hand on Erik's shoulder. The single held breath in which the entire alternate history lived and died. Erik felt the warmth. He wanted it. He chose the cold water. And in choosing the cold water, he chose without knowing that this was what he was choosing. to be the thing that kept Charles's dream honest. The voice outside the room that asked the questions the room could not ask itself. The no that made the yes mean something. The room you are in right now is very quiet. The breath you are breathing is very slow. Whatever thoughts were moving through you at the beginning of this story have found their level now. The way water finds its level, not through effort, but through the simple physics of coming to rest. You do not need to carry them any further tonight. You do not need to resolve them. You do not need to do anything with them at all. They are thoughts. They arrived. They will still be there if you need them. You do not need them tonight. There are two men on a beach in this story, and they are both, in their very different ways, trying to do the same hardest thing. To stay true to what they know in a world that does not always reward knowing it. You have carried their story through 10 long chapters of the night. You can set it down here, in the quiet, in the room that holds you without asking anything in return. The story solved itself, in its way. On a beach, in a pause, in a no that was also, if you read it carefully enough, a kind of love. Your breath is very slow. The night is doing the rest. Let whatever remains of your thinking become softer and softer until it is lighter than the air in the room, until it is simply the sound of your own breathing, and then not even that. Just the warmth of being here, in the body in the dark, at the end of a story that was always, underneath everything, about the same thing that all the good stories are about. Sleep well. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.